Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Bible study going through Avatar: The Last Airbender. Today we are discussing Book 1 and Chapter 18, or Episode 18 rather, of the Waterbending Master. If you could turn to the book of Hebrews, chapter 12 and verse 15, we're going to be discussing a very important issue here today, so I encourage you all to follow along. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 15 reads, "Looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace or goodness of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble, and by this many," not just us, many become defiled. Qatar's observation that Master Paku was a sour old man was not too far from the truth. And modeling the very same warnings made against bitterness in the Bible, we're going to use today's episode to illustrate the three areas that bitterness impacts our lives. First, in relationships, or the way you see other people. Second, in growth, the way that you pursue God. And third, in traditions, the reasons you behave certain ways over others. Now, before we go into these three examples, I think it's important to define bitterness so we understand what terms I'm using here, and there isn't any talking past one another. Bitterness is anger internalized. So, in order to properly understand that, I think there are also three key premises, things that we recognize as true before going into the argument. First of all, understand that biblically, anger isn't wrong. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26, we read, "Be angry and do not sin." So notice the two aren't necessarily conjoined. And then likewise, a later point notes that we should not let the sun go down on our wrath. There is a difference between sinning through wrath and being angry. That's not necessarily sin. Also note that anything misused or apart from the nature of God is sin. In Romans chapter 14 and verse 22, regarding a controversy that was taking place in Rome regarding whether food offered to idols was sinful or not, he presents both sides of the argument and ultimately comes to this conclusion. Do you have faith? Reasons to trust God, your relationship with God based on trust. Have it to yourself before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. This thing in your relationship with God, if it's not a bummer to you, it doesn't have to be. But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because he does not eat it from faith. So notice that this conjoining factor of your attitude before God and the things that you do are in fact relevant. Because note, whatever is not from faith is sin. It's not in line with the nature of God, and it's causing you to stumble. That's what matters. And then finally, sinful or not godlike actions and attitudes aren't to be modeled because they aren't from Him, and therefore they're not good things. In James 1:17, we read the definition of good itself, or the source, in fact. Every good and perfect gift is from above, which comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. So understand these three things. Anger isn't the issue, what we do with it is. Sin, or missing God's nature, is what we want to avoid. So thus, aligning yourself with God's nature, even with our anger, is the key. And then finally, regarding these issues, know where the good comes from. That is what's important to note when defining bitterness. So from here, we'll give examples of these real-life truths as illustrated in Avatar. So the first is bitter relationships. As the author of Hebrews pointed out, bitterness is contagious. Paku's rejection on part of Kana formed the standard for how he treated women as a concept going forward. Why? Not because he was evil, but because he was hurt. That anger turned inward is the root that the author of Hebrews is warning against. Anger isn't offense or defense, it's a spotlight on the problem. And instead of dealing with the problem, the misuse of that emotion made anger the standard going forward for how he determined relationships, especially regarding women. And whenever that wound, regarding relationships with those of the opposite sex, was irritated, the only tool in his belt was, I identify a problem. I identify a problem. I identify a problem. Anger became the only tool in his tool belt. And like the saying goes, if all that you have is a hammer, every problem begins to look like a nail. This is the mindset that you want to avoid. Because, and this is also noting what is expressed as wrath. What is abused inwardly will also be abused outwardly. You can say a lot of things about healthy relationships, but if they're defined, if they're characterized by wrath and bitterness, you don't really have to be Christian to think those aren't very good descriptors. That's why Psalm 37 and verse 8 says, "Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only causes harm." The second is regarding growth. Katara had a natural talent as a waterbender since episode 1. And yet, as a result of her being rejected by Paku, she didn't stop growing. She continued to grow through her anger. And instead of developing talent as a healer, she hated the fact that Aang was growing in the ways that she wanted to be. Well, not even that. She also, instead of developing skills that Master Zhang praised, she despised it, given that all her attention was based on her problem. Note the anger. Anger, and I think that's worth defining as well, is the emotion of blocked goals. And if it becomes your standard for growth, then you can't help but work with the materials that you've been feeding yourself with. You can only see your goal being blocked and have no other room for things like thankfulness and other things that you have. Would you consider that a positive direction to be heading in life if it makes no room for things like joy, like contentment, like thankfulness? Now note, am I justifying the way that Paku treated her? No, but am I recognizing that there is in fact a problem with becoming the very thing that you hate in others? That's why in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 8, Paul the Apostle notes this: "But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man and his deeds, and have put on the new man." Now catch this. What are we growing towards? "Who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him." Where there is neither Jew nor Greek, no racial differences, circumcised nor uncircumcised, no ceremonial differences, barbarian, Scythian, no class differences, slave or free, but Christ is all and in all. Would you consider that a direction more worth growing towards than everything is a problem and I've got to find out where it is? That's what brings us to the third point: bitter traditions. I mentioned in passing on our first point that bitterness is often the improper response to being hurt and is used to protect yourself from problems that aren't necessarily there. This has also manifested itself not only in how he viewed women, because a woman hurt him, but any mention of the concept, any association with a girl. That became his source of bitterness. That became the wound that was irritated, and he saw it as a problem. But one has to wonder, were the traditions the problem or the one reading them? Because note, what was the reason women were trained as healers in their traditions? Was it because they can't waterbend any other ways, or because they were generally better at healing than men were? Paku's bitterness turned a positive reason into a sexist boundary. I mean, perfect example. Look at Aang. He had to consciously start from scratch, basically, in regards to the waterbending master, in order to catch the basics that Katara had worked very hard to gain. But if, on the other hand, we look at how Katara found out about healing, it was kind of by accident. She had that natural talent, that natural inclination, something that even Paku had to acknowledge by the end of the episode. So notice that. The traditions weren't the issue, it's the one reading it. And another great example would be how people view men and women and their roles in the church. What was the reason Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 2 that women shouldn't teach or have authority over men, but be good mothers at home? Is it because God is a misogynist that sees no other use for women? Or is it because men and women both have callings from God and have been equipped accordingly? For example, when God tells women to be good mothers at home, that is, of course, under the presumption that they have children. If not, then you can be called differently. But here's the point: guys can't give birth. Is it sexist for God to only address women as being the ones who are mothers? Or is that just acknowledging something by definition? Likewise, saying women can't be leaders in the church, well, wait, there's already a biological limit for men. Is it unfair that there's only one spiritual limit for women? One limit, one limit. But notice this as well. If I compare both of these passages in the way that some people present them, it actually says more about the reader than what's actually being read. Let me read the first passage, 1 Timothy 2 and verse 8. I desire therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting, and in like manner also, that the women, so called to the same calling, but also note as well towards a different tendency, adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness, with good works, not just good looks, but a good heart, good conduct. Now, is that any different than what would be expected of a man? Here's where it gets controversial. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. And he explains why. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Note that was God's decision. Eve, being deceived, now catch this. Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, with self-control. Now, you can take bits and pieces of that and say, submission, that means that men are the dominant tyrants and get to determine the entire life of women going forward, right? I don't see that in the text, no. Oh, well, women learn in silence. That means women aren't allowed to say anything in church. You want to keep the opinions of women. It's a man's world in church, right? No, let me read the book of Titus, which is only 2 books later, chapter 2 and verses 1 through 5, where the same author is speaking to a different audience, but note, about the same topic. These are called the Pastoral Epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. But as for you, speak the things which are proper for sound doctrine, that older men be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, in love, in patience. The older women likewise, that they would not be slanderers, reverent in behavior, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, and catch this, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. The world doesn't like to have a strong family unit, but for whatever reason, God does. And note this as well. If there are exceptions to the rule, if women can have the opportunity and role to teach, where is it going to be most uniquely expressed? Well, probably towards an audience that isn't going to understand as personally as me being a guy. But here's the point being made. If you're bitter, if you're angry, if you've been hurt by, say, even Christians, people are going to be people. Jerks are going to be jerks regardless of what belief system they have. But here's the point that's being made. First of all, the Christian has less excuse, and you can call them out on that. But second, and even more importantly for the Christian going forward, understand the point of these passages. When we're talking about this very same issue, is it about limits or is it about opportunities? Because if there's only one limit, then what does that mean for everything else? But note this as well. I'll reiterate the same point. This says more, if you read into it, sexism and demeaning of genders about the reader than it is about the actual issue being spoken of. And here's the point in conclusion. We can't always control how people hurt us, but we can control how we respond to that hurt. We can take it on ourselves to decide where our anger goes and end up twisting our views of others and ourselves into everything but the truth. That's Master Paku and the impact that he had on Katara. Or we can allow God to determine where that hurt goes. He can be your defense and standard going forward. he can be the one who understands, and understand this as well, the kind of person who doesn't like it when someone hurts his kids. He can not only be the comforter, but the defense. He can not only be the one for consolation, but justice. And this is the point that's being made. If God if God's going to call us rather to forgive those who have hurt us, understand he's just as forgiving towards us when we hurt him. But this is what's even more important. He doesn't like it, as I said, when someone hurts his kids. He can do a far better job protecting us from further harm than we can, and likewise does a far better job punishing evil people in this world than we ever could. And this is the point that's being made, without destroying ourselves in the process. So when it comes to the issue of, okay, how do I keep this controller lid on anger? It isn't to say no or to say no feelings. It isn't to say no ever reaction or acknowledgement of problems, even when people, and especially when people, are being evil to us. The response is, and I'll note this just in conclusion, the following two passages. First, how do we deal with things when we are hurt? How do we avoid getting caught up in this root of bitterness? 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. But what about the people who have done the evil things? What about those who have hurt us? And the answer is quite simple. Romans 12 and verse 19. Notice, simple, not easy. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. This is a reference to the altar of sacrifice, a picture of the wrath of God, that he will deal with them in his time. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's not much else more than I think need be said. So thank you for your time and listening to this study. If you have any sincere questions, feel free to ask them. I look forward to talking to you more about this in the future. But until then, God bless you, and I will see you at the season